Okay, thank you all for coming to this lunch talk. It is a great pleasure to welcome Professor Go Minhee to the College of Social Science to give us the talk. And some of you probably are already aware that just yesterday, South Korea has held elections for the capital city, Seoul, and then the second largest city, Busan. And from a feminist perspective, unfortunately, these two cities are now back to be ruled by Koreans' conservative force. But then on the other hand, there are all these issues involved around the performance on gender equality of the progressive camp. It is actually a high time for anyone who is interested in South Korea to pay attention to the gender issues there, because ever since, I would say, like October 2018, since the Me Too movement broke out all over the world, South Korea probably has, arguably, but probably has the most militant Me Too movement in the whole world. Okay, and the momentum is still there. So it's really an interesting time and a good time to hear about Professor Go's talk on the institutionalizing equality, comparing the politics of gender equality in Taiwan and South Korea. Let me now turn the floor to Professor Go.
Hello, thank you for the warm welcome and introduction. My name is Minhee Go. I'm from Ewha Women's University, and it's my honor and pleasure to be able to deliver this talk at NTU, especially without my mask on in this pandemic. So what I'm going to do today is to basically introduce my project and then hopefully receive your feedback and have a discussion, ongoing discussion about the issue of gender equality and progressive politics in Taiwan and South Korea. So today's talk is organized as follows. I want to introduce you to the motivations of the project itself and then move to the puzzle. I think it's important to actually refine the puzzle, what I want to actually answer, right? And then I will move on to the concrete research questions in this project, and I'm going to lay out my argument and then introduce some of the empirical analysis, which is still ongoing. I mean, that is one of the reasons why I'm here in Taiwan, to amass some of the some evidence to support my argument, and then I want to kind of open the floor to discuss the future directions of the project. So the basic motivations of this project is about what happened to gender equality in East Asia. As I talked with Professor Hwang, I returned to Korea about 3 years ago and then got to know about the state of gender equality in Korea. And then I began to wonder how Asian countries, not only Korea, but also Taiwan, Japan, and whatnot, how do they reconcile the gap between the traditional gender values, which emphasize the proper role of men and women, as, you know, women as daughters, mothers, and what else? Workers? Daughter-in-law, right? And also the newly introduced democratic ideals of equality, that everybody is born equal, right? Not only in terms of their intrinsic values, but also in their roles, right? In the economy and society. That led to a larger question, a set of larger questions about this process of democratic consolidation and expansion of social rights. By social rights, I mean the rights, basic rights as citizens. So I hope to address in the long run the following questions. One is, how does democratic consolidation affect the expansion of social rights? As many of you already know, social rights are not granted naturally. It has to be acquired and demanded, sometimes with violence, especially for minorities who are deprived of the said social rights. And Taiwan and South Korea are interesting cases because we experience democratic consolidation, democratization, and democratic consolidation, probably more recently than the Western counterparts. So it's a very good topic to examine the relationship between democracy itself and the expansion of social rights. And the second question is more concrete about the factors that the democratic institution building affects, right, the path towards equal rights, okay? So not only am I interested in the basic kind of conditions under which the social rights are acquired, I want to kind of provide an explanation about the processes, about how the institution building actually is related to the different paths towards equal rights. I mentioned different paths because I noticed that gender equality is not the same, not enjoyed in the same way, not achieved in the same way in Taiwan and South Korea. And that really gives me this puzzle about how and why gender equality is felt and lived differently in the two countries. So the first is politics and economy in the formal realm, which is traceable by numbers. So overall, how many of you are familiar with GII? If you're interested in gender equality, or the state of Taiwan in terms of how advanced Taiwan is in terms of gender equality. GII, Gender Inequality Index, is one of the most widely used numerical indicators of gender equality that compares, right, that allows for comparison across countries. So here, we always kind of lining up the countries and where we stand on a global scale. And as you see, Taiwan is on the 9th rank with the gender index, inequality index of 0.053, which is a little bit higher than Republic of Korea, South Korea, which is on the 11th, 0.058, right? So not much of a difference, right, if you actually compare the two countries. And below that are Singapore, Japan, and China, okay? So this shows that, this really, sounds familiar, that Taiwan is one of the most advanced countries in Asia in terms of gender equality. And political representation is another area in which Taiwan actually, leads compared to other, East Asian countries. So this is the 2018, a little bit outdated. It has become even greater. The proportion of female legislators in major countries, 2018, Rwanda is number 1 because it's mandated. Taiwan is number 19 with 38.5% of female legislators. Now it's greater. Okay, with that caveat. Republic of Korea, on the other hand, it has only less than 20%. It has surpassed 20% recently, but still, it's far behind Taiwan in terms of the proportion of female legislators in the National Assembly. Okay. Third, not only in politics but also in economic sector, women actually have to have a lot to achieve in terms of pay equity and such. But before talking about gender gap in pay, let's look at this graph. Does any of you happen to know what this is? I think some of you are familiar with this, the life cycle, the labor participation rate during the life cycle. So 15 to 19, all the way to 65 and more, right? How much women participate in the labor market. And the pink line with the numbers is the line for Taiwan, right? So very few participate in the labor market early in their life. And then it soars up to 91%. Basically, almost all women participate in some capacity in the labor market between the age of 25 to 29. And then it goes a little down during their 20s and 30s, but not so much compared to other countries. Korea is this pale pink. So what is striking about Korea is that, I mean, this is not my class, so I'm gonna stop asking you questions because I'm so used to it, used to doing that to students. Oh, what does this mean? But I'm gonna just, be self-explanatory. So it follows the same path in the early 20s, but then it drops down, right? This is kind of the prime age for labor, right, for both men and women. But then it drops significantly during their 20s and 30s, and then goes up, right, in the mid-40s, and then goes down, but slightly, highly, a greater number of women participate in the labor market in the later age of their life, right? That is what is famous called the M curve. It should be more of a reverse U curve, right? As shown in the Taiwan case. If you actually have the Scandinavian countries, then it really follows the reverse U curve. But in the case of Korea, and to a certain extent in Japan, women participate early in the labor market, exits it, and then re-enters it, right? And not only is that important that they do the exit in their young age, but also when they re-enter the market, the labor market they participate in is very different from the labor market they used to be part of, right? It is more part-time, precarious, right? Because their career break during the 20s, during their 20s and 30s makes a significant mark against their career. And then there's this pay gap. I mean, you can easily imagine how that M curve might affect the gender gap in labor. So Taiwan has the lowest gender gap among the 4 nations. Again, the pale pink is Republic of Korea, South Korea. This brown line is Japan. The yellow is, the tan is the US. And then Taiwan even has the lower gender gap than the US. Right, so 14.6, right? So for $100 that everyone makes, women makes about 85. Right? And that gap is significantly higher in South Korea and Japan. Right? So these are some of the numerical indicators of gender equality, or you can say gender inequality in economics and society. And the next is more interesting about, public opinion about proper gender roles, about gender equality, what people think, right? So these data are collected from the World Value Survey. Some of you may be familiar with the survey. So they asked the same question to the people, to the representative sample of each country. So here, I mean, you can collect, data for many countries than these. But I call data for US, Sweden, South Korea, and Japan, and Taiwan to kind of, make the contrast more clear. So the first question, so these are the questions of meritocracy. So whoever does the job well deserve that position. So the first question is, first statement, you are given a statement, and then, respond to the degree of agreement, whether you strongly agree or strongly disagree. So the first statement is this: men make better political leaders than women do. Okay, so the red bars or orange bars is the proportion of people who agreed or strongly agreed with this statement. The gray or the dark gray bar is the proportion of people who strongly disagree with this statement. So as you can see, Sweden, like a very small minority of people agree with, or even strongly agree to the, point of statistical error, agree with this statement. Whereas the proportion is generally higher in East Asia, but notably so in South Korea, okay? So more than around 50% in some, level agree with this statement that men make better political leaders than women do. Is that surprising to you? Not at all. In Taiwan, about 20% of the respondents responded as such. Japan is an interesting case because the bar is short, which means that this blank amount of people said they don't really know. Okay, so they were kind of secretly, I don't really know their true preference, but the proportion of people who agree or who agree with this discriminatory statement is very similar to that of Taiwan. This is the political realm. The business, men make better business executives than women do, is pretty similar. Okay, I mean, virtually none and agreed strongly in Sweden, even though in South Korea a very significant portion of the respondents said they agree. About 50% do believe that men are better business executives or political leaders than women, whereas in Japan and Taiwan, the proportion or amount of people who agree with the statement is smaller. I mean, not that their situation is better given what happens in Japan or what happens in Taiwan is no better than what happens in Korea, but at least their ideas or opinions about gender, the meritocracy is different. So you see the contrast between South Korea and Taiwan in terms of women's capacity as compared to men's. And you can say that, Taiwan has more gender equal attitudes towards women than, say, South Korea. What about temporal trends? Has it changed over time or has it stayed the same? So here I'm only giving you the data for Taiwan and South Korea. And here, with the same question asked over and over again for the extended period of time, from the early 1990s to most recently, you see the general decline in terms of, the proportion of respondents who agreed with the statements, not only both in Taiwan, not only in, political leadership, but also in economic leadership. Right? But in Korea, it's a little bit fluctuating, right? You don't really see much trend. I mean, there is a little bit of a surge more recently, which kind of makes me wonder why. But overall, in general, we South Koreans not only maintain more conservative view towards gender equality, but also that really hasn't made much progress over time. And the second battery of questions is related to traditional roles of men and women. As you see, I mean, the first was more about, women, comparing the potential between men and women. This is more about the traditional roles of women as mothers or daughters or daughter-in-law. So here, the first question was, preschool child suffers with working mother. How many, I mean, if I ask the same question, the response would be vastly different. But here, this is kind of the question that I was most surprised with, because it is not only, just over 50% of South Koreans who agreed somehow with this statement, but it is over 60%. I mean, if you break it down with gender, I mean, both men and women actually respond in very similar ways. In Sweden, again, it is very low. Interestingly, in Taiwan, it is very low. Are you surprised? Do you think it really bears the reality? So in Japan, again, many non-respondents, but still, less than 20% of the respondents said they agree with the statement. The second is about the breadwinner. When jobs are scarce, men should have more right to a job than women, right? To what extent do you agree with this statement? Here again, South Korea has a higher proportion of respondents who agree with men taking the role of the breadwinner than women. I mean, it doesn't really say anything about the household, but, men should come first. But with this question, the U.S. and Sweden are pretty, adamant about, not agreeing with this, right? Whereas in Taiwan, not a, small percentage of people said, they should, right? So once again, if you compare the traditional roles of women, so basically to the statement that, to the notion that women belong at home, right? South Korea has a more traditional views. They espouse more traditional view of women than, say, Taiwan, right? Especially when it comes to motherhood. And temporal trends is a little bit hopeful for you guys, because here, when jobs are scarce, you might be, kind of wondering why, so many Taiwanese actually uphold this view. But in fact, there are more people who disagree with this notion, right? So there used to be a lot more people who agree with this perspective, and not long ago, right, in 1990s. But now it has gone down, but more significantly, there are more people who disagree with this view, okay? Whereas in Korea, it goes pretty parallel, right? It really fluctuates, but not to, once again, there's something going on in 2017 to 2020 that actually brought this up. The proportion of people who agree with job scarcity and men's precedence over men. But still, there is more, increase or decrease about the amount of people who disagree with this statement. So these are some of the temporal trends about the traditional roles of men and women. What kind of picture does it paint to you about gender equality, the state of gender equality in Taiwan and South Korea? You might have an impression that Taiwan, has achieved a lot. Not only in terms of policy or those measurable indicators of economic and political participation, but also in attitudinal measures about how they think about gender equality and women's roles. Another kind of facet of gender equality that is not captured easily by these numerical indicators is the state of contemporary activism, as Professor Huang mentioned, about the Me Too movement, or lack thereof. So in Korea, you see a lot of very radicalized, active feminist movement, right? Even though the society in general may be more conservative than, Taiwan, that doesn't mean that the wave of feminist movement is dormant or non-existent in Korea, okay? You see that there are many protests, sometimes violent protests in South Korea, in Seoul, or in many, cities. This is protest against spy cam, right? Actually, spy cam is a huge problem or a huge issue. I don't know about Taiwan, but in South Korea, especially among college students, you find spy cams in random places, in the restroom, in the subway station, in the restroom, in university dorms, and stuff like that. So there is a huge resistance against, or increasing awareness, right? My life is not your porn, right? And then, as Professor Huang mentioned, there is a strong Me Too movement, and then many discussions and some judicial rulings about the revelation or transgression perpetrated by the incumbents, governors, mayors, and prosecutors. So there was a strong, support, Me Too, not only Me Too, but with you, that, shows signs of solidarity. And also, recently, there is Women's Party, the Feminist Party established in South Korea. Some of my colleagues are involved in this new party establishment. Actually, in the mayoral election, that Professor Huang introduced, one candidate actually ran for the mayoral election and gained about less than 1% of votes, but still significant, 0.5667 votes from the Seoulites. And there is many online community, online activities about radical feminism. I'm not going to go deep into, to the extent of, there are many distasteful comments about women's bodies, but also men's bodies, about, very pejorative comments about men's bodies, or, there is a campaign against marriage or reproduction. So Megalian is one of those very radical feminist sites. I don't know if I can. Is there a hyperlink available? Because I made a hyperlink. How can I actually click on it? Oh, okay. Don't worry. I can move. In Taiwan's case, there are different different kinds of gender equality movements in Taiwan. It's okay, I don't have to go to the website. But you can actually go to the website and see. If you can read Korean, you will be surprised about the tone and manners of the comments there. But in Taiwan, there are some of the movements for mainstreaming gender. In public education, this is about, This is about including gender-aware education in education institutions. This is what? This is also about Me Too movement, but still there has been some type of, not criticism, but discussion about how Me Too movement in Taiwan is significantly weaker than other East Asian or other countries in general. So, to sum up, women's movement in Taiwan and South Korea are a little bit different in its characteristics. Taiwan, it is more universalistic, by which I mean it pursues gender equality. By gender, social construction of sexuality. It is based on identity, right? Who you are and realizing yourself. And also, it has been led, the first kind of initial momentum was led by more apolitical intellectual women's rights activists, including Fan Yun or other early stage movements, including Professor Huang and other activist professors and intellectuals. And also, they focused a lot on legal education and reforms in the form of literary works. Awakening Foundation is one of the most notable feminist organizations, and what they did was not only, devise policies and pressure lobbying government, but also they did a lot of work on publishing literary works and then educating, providing legal aid. Right? And the third kind of characteristic is that gender issue was more inclusive to encompass not only women's issues, but also same-sex rights. You may think that, oh, is that even a characteristic? But it is when you compare that to what happens in South Korea. Okay, that coalition is not always given. In South Korea, it is more particularistic, by which I mean that it has a constituents, right? It used to be based on a part of labor movement, factory workers, and then later prostitutes or domestic violence victims. Taiwanese women's activists also served those clientele, but it was more active and militant in South Korea. It was led by intellectuals serving disadvantaged women. And it has grassroots orientation and more particularistic and contentious, the manners in which these movements transpire, right? Sometimes violent. And finally, by dint of, by virtue of staging social movement, very wide social movement, it gained more appeal, especially in the early period, not now, among the public by focusing on victimhood, right? Domestic violence victims or workers who has long work hours and very disgraceful working situations, right? And also comfort women issues. How many of you are familiar with comfort women issues? That was a very important event in the history of women's movements in Korea. This is more of a early trend in women's movements in a comparative perspective. But now it's more radical than, say, in Korea than in Taiwan. So I lay out these puzzles to refine the state of gender equality in South Korea and Taiwan, rather than talking about gender equality in terms of rankings. Oh, we are better than other countries, or vice versa, we are worse than other countries. The patterns of gender equality or feminist movement is different in Taiwan and South Korea. Being radical can be said to be, more innovative, if you will, right? So, based on these puzzles, I can actually sum up the puzzles in such a way. Socioeconomic differences, very much measurable. Attitudinal differences are such that things are more conservative and polarized in South Korea than in Taiwan. Finally, there are some political differences, especially in the contemporary period. Radical and vocal in Korea, progressive but moderate in Taiwan. And the simple question arises from these comparisons: why do these differences exist? How do these differences occur? And my argument is that we have to go back in time to the early, 1990s or late 1980s. Were you born then? I don't really know. I was existent. So I think these differences are matters of enforcement of policies, education of the public, and expression of grievances. And how do these outcomes differ in Taiwan and South Korea is the question that I want to address in this project. And South Korea and Taiwan is a very ideal situation. There are many scholars who compare various processes, political and economic outcomes, but I think gender equality is another venue in which we can actually make a fruitful comparison between the two, because we share, like I said, cultural and historical similarities. Both Taiwan, East Asian region actually, share patriarchal culture, Confucian norms, women's proper roles as housewives, wives, daughters, and mothers were emphasized, right? Not to a more significant degree than Korea, but why does it remain so high in Korea is one of the questions. And also we experienced Japanese colonialization, which actually provided a limited set of opportunities for women's emancipation via education, modernization. But the interpretation on Japanese colonialization differs vastly between Korea and South Korea and Taiwan, as I will show you later. And finally, we experienced liberation from the authoritarian rule. Liberation from Japanese government and subsequently authoritarian rule, which actually stunted development for women's movement. We kind of lost the opportunity right after the World War II to actually advance these, women's rights, which was later realized in the late 1980s. So democratization, the lifting of the martial law, was successfully implemented in both countries in 1987, and then began the process of democratic consolidation. Okay, by which scholars agree that there should be free regular elections, right? And there should be party competition, and then there should be a sense that democracy is the only game in town, right? Juan and Lin's Democratic Consolidation is a seminal work on that. And also it was strongly buttressed by economic development and modernization. If you only have political liberalization without economic development, then something is off, right? You have to have this material affluence to actually seek political liberty. And there are already many explanations about gender gap, why there are gender gap or gender equality, or how do women achieve gender equality in each country. One is modernization theory. It is more about attitudes, that modernization leads to spreading egalitarian attitudes and facilitates gender equality, right? If you, South Korea is modern. How many of you visited South Korea? At least, externally. Modernization theory focuses on enlightening people's thoughts, right? But as we saw in the public opinion data, people's thoughts don't change that easily or so quickly, or the rate with which people's thoughts change vary from country to country. The second is economic empowerment theory, advanced by Torben Iversen and Francis Rosenbluth, several scholars of political economy. It basically argues that women's increased bargaining status as women are economically empowered. They participate in jobs. That may bring changes in public policy and the notion for gender equality. I really like this argument, except that, Korean women's bargaining position has gone up. The basic wage itself is pretty high, right? But it is, what I'm here saying is that there should be more added to the existing explanations. Not that these are wrong, but they have merits, but I want to kind of add my own contribution. Finally, electoral systems, about quota and institutional measures that affirmatively advances women's participation in the labor market, in the legislature and whatnot, okay? So there should be institutional measures that help increase women's representation. There has been so much research done on this front, so I figure that there's not much that I can add to, but electoral systems is a very important institutional measures that can significantly increase the participation, but my kind of puzzle is broader than that, so I wanted to add something. So the alternative explanation that I propose is to look at the process of democratic consolidation. And I look at the past because the ideas and institutions that initially made right after democratization, or before, after, during and after democratization, I believe is the first in history to actually people think about democracy. I mean, and then not the first time, but the first time to link the ideas with institutions. Okay, so following Lieberman, ideas and institutions matter, especially ideas about what constitutes democracy, right? Democracy has many colors, right? We have deliberative democracy, representative democracy, majoritarian democracy, rule of law, right? Which do you pick as the most important one? Would be a very interesting, has a very interesting important consequence later on, especially for minority rights. And women's, also ideas about women's rights. Is it part of human rights? Is it about men versus women, right? Elevating leveling the playing field. I mean, those ideas may have formed very differently from the onset. And that might have led to divergent institutional interactions. And path dependence is a mechanism in which I can adopt to explain the divergent processes. Margaret Levy, Paul Pearson. Path dependence here is about how democratic consolidation in the nascent period, in the formative period, may give us a clue about the varying realities and perceptions on gender equality in the two countries. Okay, and the divergent modes of democratic consolidation about party institutional building or ideas formation may lead to the different scope and extent of gender equality debate. So, answers to the puzzle: enforcement, education, and the expression of grievances. I mean, those are the, areas in which gender equality may take place, are conditioned by the ideational and institutional setup during the early stages of democratic consolidation. That is the kind of tentative argument that I want to make. And that has a sticky nature, because once it is established, the trends tend to yield increasing returns through policies, public opinion, and elections and campaigns. Once set up, I mean, it is very hard to go back or change unless something significant happens. Then, exactly what do I mean by ideas? I mean, here, ideas about democracy. In Taiwan, I believe that the prime kind of ideas around this gender equality debate is about the rule of law, or changing the law, or amending the law, constitutional democracy, that everybody is equal before the Constitution, right? I mean, that sounds as a matter of fact, right? I mean, that belief is still there in Korea too, but what is more important in South Korean context, I think, is this idea of majoritarianism, that democracy should be about what people want. 국민, right? The 민주주의, right? That people are the, principles in democracy, in the democratic institution. So based on these different ideas of democracy, the consolidation process may lead to unintended consequences for determining the characteristics and directions of women's movement. I mean, not only women's movement, but progressive movement in general. Okay, so women's rights or minority rights in general tend to benefit from the formal conception. Okay, I mean, minority by minority, I don't mean numerical minority. Women are half the nation, right? But in terms of legal scholarship, citizenship, or social rights, women have to actually follow or achieve what is already established by their male counterparts. In that sense, women have more to demand or more to change, more to propose, right? And that can be difficult to achieve if you follow this majoritarian principle of democracy. Then how are they reflected in institutions? I mean, ideas are floating, it's abstract, right? It has to be concretely brought down to the reality and institutionalized. And in Taiwan, the democratic consolidation has been going on by the centralized institutional building and growing party attachments. You have a very weak or loose bipartisan coalition, one over KMT or one over DPP, right? And then not only that, I mean, that is a kind of a familiar argument, but also added to that, there is this judicial independence and activism in Taiwan, much more so than in South Korea. In South Korea, on the other hand, we see this decentralized bottom-up democratization in the early period by student protests. I mean, it happened later in Taiwan too, but that wave was so strong, and then it really maintained its control up until now. And state and civil society interactions was pretty active. And the Constitutional Court was established much later than, say, in Taiwan. It was established after democratization in 1988 or 87. And it followed this strategic deliberation. Rather than leading the public opinion, it followed, it closely observed what the public wanted, or the what do you say, the atmosphere of the society, and that made the Constitutional Court sensitive to political contexts. And finally, path dependence. What I mean by path dependence here is that there is a continuation and institutionalization of party politics in Taiwan after democratization. It's not that KMT was just demolished or abolished, right? You maintain the structure, and then there is another party added to the scene, right? I mean, that's not what happened in Korea, for example. And then plus judicial activism gave women's issues much leeway in mainstreaming gender equality because the parties are there, right? And informal institutions and public opinion. And that really leads to expansion and liberal orientation, where by liberal means liberal constitutional. And in South Korea, party system is much fragmented. Right? There is a merger, split, creation of parties. I don't even remember. It is very hard for professors like, of Korean politics to teach the party history because there are so many who came up and down, right? I will show you later. Not only parties were fragmented, but also democratization or following consolidation process was heavily based on movements, social movements. And that really created various active, very highly active social movement groups, including women's movement. And they cater to a specific group of women based on salient issues. There are salient issues about family household registration, about abortion, and such of the time. But I have to say it's not failed, but it was compromised to make gender a universal issue of human rights, right? We discussed gender in terms of sexual equality between the sexes rather than human rights itself. So there still remains much conservatism and more problematically polarization, especially among youth nowadays. Men and women in their 20s in Korea are severely divided over the issue of gender equality. And so it experienced a little bit of contraction and radical orientation. So that is kind of my tentative argument. I welcome your feedback and questions about this. So I'm still conducting empirical analysis. But I want to focus on party development and want to hear about the people who were actively involved in the initial process of democratization. Taiwan, as you may already know well, there is a loose bipartisan system, and DPP especially became successful by forging a broad coalition of progressive forces, including LGBTQ groups, environmentalists, women, etc. And it also strategically empowered women politicians by measures of quota and whatnot, and broadened the demographic base for electoral support. It didn't really happen in Korea, especially in the early period of democratization. You didn't really have to appeal to the women voters or include women politicians. But it has a very weak class basis. So class is a huge social cleavage that divide parties in Korea, but not so much in Taiwan. South Korea, as I mentioned, fragmented parties. Parties are formed around strong political leaders. Right? So as a partisan, you attach yourself to the politician rather than the party itself. There are fans of certain political figures rather than the fans for a certain political party. There is high electoral volatility as a function of fragmentation. Mergers, creation, and dissolution of parties is pretty common. So I have a hard time following the total number of parties in Korea for the past 30 or so years. And it also is male-dominant, patronage-style recruitment with few ideological differences across parties. So especially at the local level, right? Local strongholds are usually male. In order to win election, it doesn't really matter which party you go to as long as you're nominated, right? It doesn't matter which party, it matters, right? But it matters not because of the ideological alliance, right? But because certain parties are supported in certain regions. So, progressive party development in Taiwan, DPP actively in the very early period in its foundation in 1986 incorporated gender equity in the party platform early on. I mean, once again, how surprising is that? I was surprised, but you may not, right? I mean, this is, I think, what merits comparison, because you might think that it is pretty similar to each other, but it is not. And then, gender equity was mentioned under labor and social welfare policies, so it might have some limitation in terms of pay equity, daycare, and equal employment. So I made a link to the Library of Congress in the United States, which actually contains the original document of DPP platform. It's fascinating that they actually have the English translated version of the DPP party platform for Taiwan. So if you have time, go to Library of Congress in the United States and check it out. I don't think I can actually access it now. And this, what do you think is this? Yeah, it's the many political parties that were created and then merged and disappeared over time. The blue bars, the blue squares are conservative parties. I mean, the people are still there. It's just the name of the parties or, the structure of the party that changed. And it spawned off some baby parties too. And the liberal, right? So interestingly, there is a very strong lineage of progressive parties based on labor, where its ties with the North Korea. Liberal parties, once again, it is very personalistic in the sense that there are notable liberal party leaders who actually were in charge of different parties, right? So if you don't agree with the faction, you don't stay, but you just get out and create another party. So party fragmentation or volatility is pretty significant in Korea. And Not only that, party fragmentation, it had a very strong class basis. A liberal party development in South Korea went in such a way that it clearly tries to appeal to the middle class or working class voters. Democratic Peace Party was first established by Kim Dae-jung, later who becomes the president. It was a liberal opposition party founded by Kim Dae-jung, and it promulgated as the party of middle class. I don't know how many of you can read Korean. 중산층 is middle class. 근로자, labor, farmers and fishermen, 농어민, and 우리 모두. And basically a class-based party. I mean, they claim that, we are the party of the oppressed. And also it predicated upon the regional cleavage between Southeast and Southwest. You know how President Park Chung-hee used to favor his hometown area, which was located in the Southeast, and as a result, Southwest region didn't really receive the boon of economic development for a long time, which really generated a lot of grievances and complaints from the people of the region. Not only economically, but socially, there is this stigma tied to a certain region. And another kind of tree, a branch of the party tree, is the Progressive Party. It has developed separately from liberal parties later on around labor unification issues. It's identity, national identity with North Korea. But as it didn't achieve the majority support, which is important in majoritarian democracy, which will kind of lead to a bipartisan system, it remains highly fragile. Okay, so it was Democratic Labor Party. Now it's the Justice Party to actually expand its clientele or constituents, not only to the working class, but also to more progressive forces, including LGBTQ. But it's not that successful. That is the party development story institutionally. The second is has more to the ideas about how constitution matters in Taiwan and in South Korea. I call it the judicialization of the rights discourse. In Taiwan, just think about what you hear often when you hear the discussion about gender equality or equality in general. It is about self-determination, that you are the one that should be in charge of yourself. Determine what's best for you. And human rights is a very important tenet. And also social change issues, not political change or economic development, but social change is an important issue. And I have to work on it, but in the very beginning, the social movement groups relied less on litigation than political solutions. So they, instead of relying on civil litigations, they actually took to the political channels by, influencing parties and lobbying the parties. Also, this gender issue is broad enough to encompass early on the same-sex rights. Okay, you may think that they are closely related, but they started differently, and then, it became a, wide bubble based on Article 7. Article 7 is what? Everybody's equal before the law. You should not be discriminated against based on your sexual orientation or gender and whatnot. And here, interestingly, referenda versus judicial reinterpretation. We see the instance from the same-sex marriage that judicial reinterpretation takes precedence over the referenda. That will not happen. That is very unlikely to happen in South Korea, for example. In South Korea, the civil society or social movement groups right after democratization or in the process of democratic consolidation involved very much activists, lawyers, and we see a lot of social movements of which gender was part of, women's movement was part of. But they coalesced, they made a coalition from time to time, but later on, women's movement remained. Some of them actually went to the mainstream party, became politicians, but there are remainders of women's movement which later became more radicalized. And then NGOs employed litigative strategies. I mean, I have more to say about that because of the expansion of the legal market. Basically, you have more lawyers who can work on public interest. But even though they actually, had a lot of litigations going on, the constitutional courts were pretty reluctant to actually reverse the existing system. So they took an incremental and conservative approach to uphold tradition rather than declaring discriminatory practices unconstitutional. If you go to Article 9 of the Korean Constitution, it's a very interesting clause. Article 9 is about that we should strive to thrive national culture and sustain it, or something like that. It's about upholding traditional culture and valuing traditional culture, and that was invoked, for example, during the litigation on household registration, and. Usually, in order to make changes, you rely on general public opinion, rallies, and protests. And there are two more slides. The constitutional identity. Then, what do people think about the Constitution, or how is Constitution has developed over time? Here, party plays a central role, and party leadership changes central role, I think. And the sustenance of KMT, it was not abolished, as I mentioned, it didn't disappear, it remained the same. So up until 1987, the ROC Constitution heavily, the judicial independence was heavily suppressed. And there was a huge entanglement of executive and judicial branches to uphold the leadership of Chiang Kai-shek. And I think personally the transitional period is very important because it was then when the Council of Grand Justices began to deliver interpretations on the ground of unconstitutionality. So it becomes more active and independent to reverse previous decisions and in the spirit of contemporary democratic reforms. And what played a central role here is Lee Teng-hui's leadership, who was Taiwan-run, right? Not the mainlander, that within KMT, that actually was a little bit threatening. So that motivated KMT leaders to promote human rights because now they are in the peril of being a minority within the party, which continued as it became the opposition party in 2000 on. So as KMT, the strongholds of KMT, the mainlander leaders of KMT gradually lose power within the party, actually, as well as against the party of DPP, they end up upholding the judicial independence, because it used to be very much entangled, so they were afraid that power was concentrated too much upon the executive branch and the legislative branches. And after DPP take over, the continued process of separation of powers and judicial independence continues, and appointment of liberal justices propels activism. The constitutional identity in South Korea is a little bit different. 1987 democratization really was a departure from the past. After the assassination, there were some vestiges of authoritarian rule, but the parties were newly created, the new leaders were emerged, okay? But here, if you go back to the constitutional history, we follow the initial constitution from the 1948, which was heavily emphasized by socialists. So just to give you some background about the early independence activists from Japan's colonial rule, the early drafters of the Constitution were from the Korean Provisional Government and established in Shanghai, the region, and they were influenced by Chinese Communist Party. And I mention this because this tendency about economic justice and citizenship still rings true in the party competition or the national debate about democracy, about how a majoritarian public, mainly workers, should take a lead rather than elites who are economically and professionally better off. And once again, the Article 9 invokes nationalist and traditional legacy, which is not very helpful for gender equality because, you know, minority movements or women's rights movements has to reverse the previous custom and tradition. But because it is ingrained in the Constitution, it is very hard to change it or declare anything unconstitutional. So you see, I hope that my argument was clear enough to give you some ideas about the comparison between Taiwan and South Korea. So this is only the beginning. So while I'm staying in Taiwan, I wanted to meet many people, which is one arm, one prong of my research strategy, elite expert interviews. I meet politicians, activists, and professors who are actively engaged in the democratization or consolidation or women's movement processes. And also, I think that what's written in documents is very important. So I plan to track constitution, party platform documents, legal precedents, meeting minutes, and so on, so that I can trace their ideas, how their ideas were expressed in those documents. And finally, I want to kind of know the state of the affairs by employing quantitative analysis, World Value Survey, Asian Barometer, and East Asian Social Survey and such. So by triangulating these data, I hope to paint a clearer picture of the variation of gender equality in Taiwan and South Korea. So any questions or comments are welcome. And if you have any suggestions about my empirical strategies in Taiwan, that would be also great. So thank you for your attention. And if you have any questions or comments, not only about my research, but about Ihwa or Korea in general, you can email me at minheego@ihwa.ac.kr. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks for the very interesting presentation. We still have about probably like 20 minutes left, so let's collect the questions and the comments, probably 2 or 3 for one round, and then come back to Professor Go, and then we go to the next round of questions and the comments. Yeah, go ahead. There's mic from there.
Thank you. Hello, Professor Minhee Go and Professor Huang, and I'm Andy from International Business Department. I have 2 questions. And what is equality? Does it mean that it brings equality when women and men have same chances in all aspects in the society? This is my first question. And my second one will be, do you take the difference between, the discrimination between men and women rights a problem or phenomena? For example, you have a question that women make better political leaders than men or not, and a lot of people disagree with that. But But these people who disagree may think that men are better than women since the political environment is better for men to get promoted. So they see a lot of successful men politicians. But it doesn't mean that they discriminate against men. This is just a phenomenon, not a problem. Yes, this is my 2 questions. Sorry, a little bit too long.
No, that's okay. But your first question probably takes a year to answer, or hundreds of years to answer. But Professor Go probably will answer it within 2 minutes. Anyway, let's collect the second question. Yeah.
Any questions?
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you, Professor Go and Dr. Huang. And I'm Meng Zhong from Department of Sociology. I have only one question. It's about what's your opinions or observation on the role of state, which means the components of the government. Is there any women's policy agency within Korean governments which could allow women movements to affect policy more substantially? I ask this question because in Taiwan's case, I think many of these our audience has known we have some policy agency within the government which allow women movement have more powerful to affect our policy. And what's your opinion about this question? A little bit question. Thank you.
Let's have the third, so then Professor Go can answer the first round of questions. Comments are also welcome, if you don't agree with her. Yeah, she probably will welcome the not agreeing opinion, so she can enhance the part. Yeah. Well, the director should wait. Let's have the student first.
Presentation. I'm Jen Chen, second-year master's student in sociology. And I guess I have 2 related questions. The first one is about, in your presentation, you have mentioned 3, you're kind of try to explain 3 kind of difference in between Korea and Taiwan, right? Political and attitudinal and socio-economic one. But it seems to me that in your presentation you focus more on the political one. So I was just wondering, how do you make sense, or how do you explain the attitudinal difference by the institutional difference between Korea and Taiwan? And the second one is that if I didn't misinterpret a slide where you show there's the attitudinal difference between Korea and Taiwan, I noticed that there is a 6 difference before 1980s. So I just wondering, how do you make sense there exists this kind of some of the difference even before 1980s, before everything happened, before democratization? Thank you.
Okay, let's have Professor Go's response.
Okay, these are fascinating questions. I always enjoy taking questions from students. Equality, that's a huge question. I can actually, spend a year. But here, I would suggest 2 different kinds of equality. One is substantive equality. Second is procedural equality. I think that substantive equality means that, there should be some type of qualitative equality between men and women, even though, we legally, there's nothing that really separates men from women, but as an outcome, we see those differences about gender gap in payment, in pay, or labor market participation and whatnot, right? So substantive equality involves more affirmative action in favor of addressing those differences and outcomes. But procedural equality means that, there shouldn't be any discrimination in the hiring process or, in asking for a leave and whatnot, right? So those 2 are the differences that those are the 2 different the differences about equality that I think are important when we talk about gender. Substantive equality, of course, is a more controversial form, right, than say procedural equality. One may agree that, there shouldn't be any discrimination in the procedure of employment and whatnot, but how do you measure those very subtle, right? Differences in the outcome. So I will just end there. Second phenomena, what was? So about men's role and men's capability versus women. So you are talking about the validity of the question itself, right? From what background do these respondents say that, men make better political outcomes, leaders, not because they are superior to women, because of the political system, right? I think that's a very important question. Maybe respondents are aware of the practical limitations that women face in electoral arena or in business arena. But at the same time, these are questions that time and again were asked with men, right? If that's the case, that political environments actually deter women from participating or becoming a better leader in business or politics, then we might expect the decrease in the proportion of those who agree with those comments. But in South Korea, that didn't happen, even though things are much better compared to 1990. Right? We didn't have the quota in 1990. Now we have quota. But still, the trend stays the same. That really tells you something about people's intrinsic belief about men and women, not because of the political environments or changes thereof, but because their conception of men and women's proper place in the society. Third is state government. We do have the Ministry of Gender Equality. Okay, it's called 여성가족부, women and family. I know that there was a discussion about establishing a ministry-level agency in Taiwan, but they didn't. But we have the ministry, and women's movements in Korea, activists actually take an executive path, right? They appeal to the president, or they appeal to the public opinion, that which translates into the executive election. But that I didn't mention it here. I only mentioned legislature and the judiciary because executive path is pretty volatile in my opinion. They are dependent upon the character of the president, for example, right? That was more salient in Korean politics, for example. President Kim Dae-jung is a Nobel Peace Prize laureate. He was very much interested in human rights. His wife was a women's movement activist, so he did a lot of things that advanced women's rights, but did it really sustain or change public attitude? That didn't. So I think that, even though there was government policy machinery within the government, that doesn't really change the broad conception of gender equality, or that doesn't really, temporarily improve the situation. Fourth, I focus on political aspect, not so much because I emphasize ideas, especially because that was ingrained and embedded in how women's activists in Taiwan, for example, spent a lot of time in education. Okay, I mentioned three elements: enforcement, education, and expression of grievances. Enforcement of policies is what? The legal order, right? But it is one thing to implement the law. It is one thing to pass the law, but another to implement the law. We are not behind. South Korean government is not behind in promulgating or implementing Employment Equality Act. Actually, it was passed earlier than, say, in Taiwan. Okay, we have those legal devices, but enforcement was something else. And education was important among women's activists in Taiwan. I mean, that I met with lawyer Minhee, and she talked a lot about how they spent a lot of energy in, communicating with the public by, way of the Awakening Foundation. So, I have to amass evidence, but I think that ideas matter because, it's like, air, we can't catch it, but it is there. So that can be distilled through institutions, right? I think that I answered all the questions.
Probably the last one a little bit about the socioeconomic culture one. So right? the third questions. Yeah. So do you want to sort of respond to that a little bit?
Yeah, that is a sort of situation because if I can compare data before and after democratization, that would be great. And that is why I included the temporal trends, just to track as much as I can about the temporal changes. But fortunately, Taiwan see the decline, right? Some type of pattern, right? Temporal pattern, whereas we don't really find it in Korea, where even the backlash is pretty severe in the Korean situation. So the starting point is different, definitely. But I think that, that can be kind of complemented by the temporal trend that I showed you, that, progression, where progress, societal progress is going on, at least in public opinion in Taiwan. Korea is more precarious in that regard. But I see your point that you have to go back, and I can't go back in time to the 1980s to ask people. But yeah, if I can, if you happen to come across those data, then feel free to shoot me an email.
Yeah, there is I think there is the problem of the limitation of data availability, because as you could see, that Professor Go actually based on those attitude, when she talked about those attitude differences, she used the data from World Value Survey, and both South Korea and Taiwan joined the World Value Survey since the early 1990s. So it will be very difficult to go back beyond that, yeah, especially when you want to have the data that are comparable to each other. Yeah, so it's a little bit difficult. Let's have the next round. Probably 2 more questions. I see at least 3 hands. Okay, so one here and the other here, and the last one we come back to Professor Lan. Yeah. Yeah. Go ahead.
So, thank you, Professor Go. Thanks for your presentation. And my name is Li Chen, a graduate student of Political Science Department. And I have some ideas to share. I wonder if the authoritarian legacy explains the difference of women empowerment between Taiwan and Korea, because there's a branch of literature suggesting that party regimes perform better on women empowerment, because they rely more on larger ruling coalitions, and they are more capable of mobilizing social support, so which makes them more inclusive compared to other types of dictatorships, like military regimes, which is the case in Southern Korea. So I wonder if that could be an institutional factor to explain the difference between South Korea and Taiwan.
Yeah, and the question here.
Hello, Professor Go and Professor Huang. I'm Irene Nakano, at Department of Political Science. So I want to make a quick comment first about the non-respondents in the public opinion in Japan, about political leaders and business executives, because I think when you ask someone who has never seen a woman politician or woman business executive, then I think that person will just answer, I really don't know, I don't have opinion about that. That's still very common in rural parts of Japan. So yeah, for example, maybe they have never elected a woman legislator, nor nor the executive from the companies are usually men. So this is my first comment. So secondly, I also have a question about the public opinion, because about the public opinion in Korea about political leaders, many people think that that makes them uncomfortable to see women becoming political leaders. So I wonder how people, especially from the conservative, think about the former president Park Geun-hye, how they perceive her, because she's actually from a conservative party. Yeah, that's my question. Thank you.
Well, if I may, I just want to add one note about reserving their opinion. Professor Go showed the public opinion. A lot of the Japanese actually reserve their opinion. So when they were asked about all these gender issues, they say, we don't know, I don't know. Actually, it's not just the public. We recently have a survey done about, parliamentary members. A lot of the Japanese parliamentary members are also like that. when you ask them questions. And in terms of the linkage between public opinion and the elite opinion, Korean is, we haven't published our results yet, but from the data, Korean is the most polarized one. Their publics are more polarized. Their elites are also more polarized among the 3 East Asian countries. And Taiwan actually is highly convergent. Japan is also convergent, but Japan has a whole bunch of people who basically just say, I don't know, So anyway, the last question comes back to Professor Lang. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for the talk. My question is about social class. Because you talk about, compared to Taiwan, South Korea, either the parties or the women's movements are more class-based. And you seem to suggest that it makes the issues of gender equality not so much a universalistic issue, and not like in Taiwan we frame that more like a human rights. So my question is, would it possible in South Korea it's also bring some positive consequences that we don't see it in Taiwan? For example, to build strong coalition with working class movement, and also wondering if the human rights front is not used in South Korea. What kind of cultural front are Koreans women movements leaders used to frame the issue of gender inequality?
A lot of inspirations from these comments and questions that come to my mind about party regime. I was initially intending to include that, the persistence of KMT is a blessing in disguise, maybe, for minority rights movement, because, party regime actually is a very important organizational structure to make a claim, especially, through a legislature or, later through judiciary. And it's not that, after 1987, it's an exogenous shock, but that doesn't mean that you are departing from the past completely, right? Especially so in Taiwan, because KMT still ruled and held power, right? And as I mentioned, the leadership change actually, changed the within party dynamic to allow for the room to maneuver for many women's rights movement. And in the very beginning, not apolitical, but women's movements activists were tactical in the sense that they actually contacted both KMT and DPP to advance their ideas about gender equality. It was not a polarizing issue. So in that sense, I totally agree with you that I have to consider authoritarian legacy or the pre-democratization situation to understand how party dynamic or those downward movement actually is related to gender equality. The second, lack of exposure to women leaders, political and economic leaders. I think that is why it would be much more fruitful to include Japan in the scene, right? It's a fully democratic system. It didn't really go through democratic reversal. Authoritarian regime breakdown. But my bigger argument here is that democracy itself doesn't guarantee, or democratization itself doesn't guarantee equal rights. Okay, it is what happens before, during, and after the democratic movements, about the ways in which democratic consolidation happens that determine the path towards the shape of gender rights. So Japan is an interesting case because it has an institution. I don't know about ideas, what kind of democracy Japanese thinks as ideal. Is it majoritarian? Is it constitutional, or what? Right? Is it just the status quo? So if I have a chance to work with Professor Huang and others in Japan, that would be great. I think it should be the more regional project about understanding the parameters of gender equality in East Asia. And finally, the positive outcomes coming out of the class politics. I think we have achieved very much progress early on about ensuring labor rights, and Professor Hagen Ku's book about class consciousness dedicates a chapter to the role of women workers in contributing to the labor rights movement. So I think it's the other way around, that women laborers actually contributed a lot to forming this class consciousness, and then spearheading the labor movement, even though that was kind of overshadowed by the later kind of force of democratization. I have to really think about the relationship between labor and women's movement. I mean, there are many studies that have already been done in the South Korean context. But the lack of this class consciousness in Taiwan, I think, really is an interesting puzzle to me. Right? Why don't really Taiwanese link class with gender inequality? I mean, as much as they do with human rights, I think it's another query that we can pursue down the road. But that is a fascinating question that I don't have an answer for at this moment.
Well, I guess time is up, and those of you who still have questions and comments, I think are welcomed to approach Professor Go after we, end this lunch talk. So let's give another round of hands to Professor Go's interesting presentation.
감사합니다.
And she has her email here, so you can also write her.
垃圾记得要带走哦，这里不能丢垃圾。